Bienvenidos a Tres Respuestas, un espacio de discusión, de conversación y de propuestas. Nuestro invitado de hoy es Jon Clifton, el presidente y CEO de Gallup, autor de este maravilloso libro conocido como Blind Spots, donde habla de aquellas cosas que no se están percibiendo con respecto a los sentimientos de infelicidad en todo el mundo. Es un verdadero honor tener a una de las personas que mejor conoce la opinión pública a nivel global. Jon, thank you so much for being with us here in Tres Respuestas in this podcast. I'm so honored to have you with us this morning.
Mr. President, it's an honor to be on your show. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I am so delighted to have you because we've had a lot of conversations, and you published a book that I consider one of the most influential books about how to read public opinion globally, and you called it Blind Spots. Why don't you share with the people who are listening to us and watching us, what is your definition of a blind spot and why we should give so much importance to read, to understand, and to solve some of those blind spots that are happening globally inside public opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. The leadership blind spot right now that we believe that so many leaders have is what we call the emotional economy, which is really accounting for how people feel. And what does that mean exactly? I'll give you an example, because when you think of the emotional economy, it's not just the emotional economy for societies, but it's also the emotional economy for organizations and for individuals. And a great example of it has to do with a simple example of a customer at a bakery. And for whatever reason, and this is a true story, there was a small bakery in a town, and there was a woman, she was their best customer. I think she spent about $1,000 a month with them. But anyway, one day she said, I'm never going back. She fired him. Now, if you went to a traditional economist or a statistician, whatever, to say, analyze what took place, what they would say is, did you increase the price? Was there an increase in the wait time? Or how about shrinkflation? Did they reduce the quality of the product? What they would have found is that none of that explained why she left. What explained why she left is because one of the employees disrespected her, and she vowed at that moment to never return. That moment quantified is the emotional economy, and it's something that happens not just with individuals, not just with organizations, but societies as a whole. And what we saw in many historical events, because we've been tracking the emotional economy for almost 20 years in over 140 countries, where we now see that before events like in Tunisia or Egypt with the Arab uprising, that there were massive declines that took place in terms of how people felt, despite the fact that there were massive rises in things like GDP per capita or even low unemployment. This is why we think that leaders, while they've had a massive focus on the rational economy, they haven't had the same focus on the emotional economy.
You have also made some assessments in a specific regions of the world where, for example, basic statistics tells us that the income per capita has been increasing, that the poverty rate has been reducing, that the Human Development Index has been behaving with good trends. But even though those things may seem positive, there are also big risks because people are feeling unhappy. And I remember that you were able to detect things that were happening in Chile, in Colombia, and Peru at the time, as you mentioned also in the Arab countries, but you also tested in Europe and Asia and even in the United States. How can leaders, how can policymakers give more attention to measure that unhappiness? But I also want to ask you, what do you think is driving that unhappiness sentiment? Is it fake news? Is it polarization? What do you think are the elements that are behind that unhappiness sentiment that you have been measuring?
Well, one is just getting behind the idea in terms of your first question, is just measuring it in the first place. And again, for almost 100 years now, the world has been obsessed with kind of traditional economic indicators, which really accounts for the world's rational economy, things like GDP per capita or unemployment. But the reality is that we don't have indicators on how we feel. So we don't have anything to look at whether or not global anger is contracting or expanding, or something like stress, is that contracting or expanding? And so 20 years ago, we tried to build indicators so that leaders could actually follow in their societies to see if these emotional aspects of life are actually improving or getting worse. And I think one of the most significant trends that has us very concerned is that when we aggregate the 5 negative emotions that we track, anger, stress, sadness, physical pain, and worry, we've seen a dramatic rise over the past 10 years that has taken place almost systematically around the world. And that has us very concerned.
You mentioned to me once that one of the things that keeps you up awake at night is that sentiment of sadness and loneliness. And why don't you tell us some of the findings that you have seen there? Because one of the things that struck me in the conversation that we had was that you said that in the segment of the population where people are feeling more sad is not in the elder people, but it's more in the younger generations. Why don't you tell us about that, and what do you think is driving that sentiment? Because that's worrying, and that has to do also with the evolution, for example, of mental health, and how would that impact future behaviors in society?
Well, you had asked earlier about what are the key drivers about what makes a great life. And one of them is this concept that we call social well-being. And of course, the absence of social well-being is the sentiment of loneliness. And when we first did this about 15 years ago, we went out to just ask people about social connections. And we asked in a way where we said, over the past 14 days, how many people have you interacted with? And it was remarkable because there are so many people around the world that would say 150, 100, some might say 75. There are a few that would say 10. But then there were the percent of people who said 0. And we found that there are 6% of adults globally that did not interact with a single human outside of that interview over a 2-week period of time. And that kind of social isolation, when you look at 6%, affects 330 million adults globally, which is exactly the same size as the entire United States. And loneliness is not just something that doesn't feel great, it's also something that can be deadly. New research that came out of BYU actually says that it can increase your chances of dying by 50%. So it's really the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes every single day, because humans need connection. And so we looked into it more deeply, more recently, and we asked about loneliness and social connection. And interestingly enough, to your point, what we found is that older populations actually feel less lonely, they have less connections, but they also feel less lonely. It's younger people who feel more connected, but they actually feel more lonely. So, if there's anything where there might be a solution here, it could even be across generations to help bridge some of these gaps with respect to loneliness.
I've been following that particular analysis, but also this week through Semaphore, I saw indicators from new measurements that you've made on how people describe great jobs and how people are feeling happy in their workplace. And the numbers are pretty shocking. And I want to try to connect that with the sentiment of loneliness and unhappiness. What have you found in how people are feeling in the workspace, and particularly after the pandemic, Jon?
Well, so you touched on one of the other primary drivers of a great life, which is a great job. And the reason for that is when you just look at the amount of hours that a human being spends in a lifetime working, the only thing that we do more is sleep. So work is a huge part of a human being's life. And, people don't necessarily hate work. In fact, when we asked the entire world, how do you feel about work? 80% of people said back to us that they actually enjoy the work that they do. But there's some kind of breakdown that's taking place because there's a great deal of misery that's happening right in the workplace. And that's kind of what the answer is what's the breakdown? It's not the work, it's the workplace. And that's what's causing a great deal of misery. And so one of the things that we attempted to do was build an indicator for how is life at work going. And we built a set of 12 questions where we asked people whether or not they know what's expected of them at work, which interestingly enough, a full 50% of the world does not fully know what they're supposed to be doing at work every single day, which can create a great deal of unnecessary stress on an individual. Another item is just whether or not they have the things they need to do their job effectively. You know, a lot of people, at least here in the United States, know that teachers really struggle to have the materials they need to do their job effectively. And it doesn't mean that they don't like teaching. They love to teach. But when they don't have the things they need in order to deliver great teaching, it can be very stressful and very frustrating for them. But we even ask things like whether or not they have a best friend at work. And it's probably one of the most controversial questions that we've asked. But we can see that when people do have best friends at work, they not only are far less likely to suffer from this loneliness crisis that so many are talking about, but we also find that it's very good for businesses and organizations, because one of the things that it does is it actually improves retention. People join organizations for a brand, but what makes them stay is often their colleagues. So creating best friends at work is actually a very good thing. So that's what we've been quantifying. And the overall finding that we had on that was that about 23% of people, when you look at life at work, are fully engaged, which is a good thing because that's almost doubled over the past decade. But the problem is, in absolute terms, that means that 77% aren't. So although there's been great improvement in terms of the global workplace, in absolute terms, the global workplace is still broken.
And Jon, I can't wait to ask you this. Once you have those assessments, once you have get the lessons, and you have gotten into the weeds and trying to interpret how people feel, you're also a CEO and you run one of the most prominent global brands. What kind of lessons have you taken from this assessment that you have been putting in practice inside Gallup that maybe you would like to share with other people who are business leaders and who are also aware of this loneliness crisis globally?
Well, one is that we find that if you really want to build a great workplace, you need to invest in your managers, because managers are the ones that sort out problems that people have day to day in order to get their jobs done. You know, the teacher example that I had mentioned, getting them the resources that they need to do their jobs effectively. Oftentimes that just rolls right up to the manager. And we find that 70% of the variance between teams and organizations globally is explained by who it is that you've named manager. So at Gallup, we take that very seriously. And we make sure that our managers are trained and that they're given whatever it is they need in order to support the individuals on their team so that they can do their jobs effectively.
And new generations, for example, because one of the things that I've been taking as maybe reflections on some of the measurements, but also in some of the books that I've been reading recently, including a great book that came out almost a month and a half ago called The Anxious Generation, has to do also with generations that are more anxious in terms of their life expectations, that tend to behave more as labor nomads and not sedentary. Like they want to start changing experiences in a very fast and permanent way. What do you think we could do globally in order to put more attention in the way the younger generations are feeling? And how do you think that the reading of this sentiment of public opinion can help us maybe improve better policies to avoid a major crisis in the future when it comes to this sentiment of loneliness, anxiety, and maybe unhappiness?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, I think every single generation, when they are the young generation, just like you and I at one point in our lives, you know, everybody kind of looks at the next generation coming up and, you know, says that they don't get it or they don't work as hard as the rest of us. I know millennials, at least in the United States, used to get charged with some of the same things. And there were even studies that said that we worked more hours and volunteer more hours than our peers. So I do think that with each generation, there are new things for us to learn. And maybe it's that they're more adaptable. Maybe it's that their strengths are that they enjoy solving problems more than other generations. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from those particular generations and embrace some of the behaviors that they think are what's best for work. That said, I do think one of the challenges that management is facing right now is adapting to a more virtual and hybrid environment. And one of the challenges is that, at least here in the United States, and you talk about workplace friends and loneliness, is that after school, when you look at a human being's life and study it, the number one place that people make friends is at work. And when we are meeting colleagues over Zoom, it's getting more difficult to do because while it is a great thing to maintain relationships, it's also a lot harder to build them virtually. So we have to figure out environments on what is it that we do to bring people together so that they can build those lasting and sustainable relationships. The other thing is that sometimes there was a Microsoft study about this, about how do you make sure that developmental opportunities stay equal across everyone. And that's a huge challenge that all organizations are facing because human beings are always out of sight, out of mind. And when people are working in a more virtual and hybrid context, sometimes to those that are giving out developmental opportunities, they might miss people simply because of their proximity. So this is a really big challenge that management is facing. And we've seen in the United States, at least right now, that since the pandemic, there's been a 6-point decline in overall engagement. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but each of those individual points represent 1.5 million American workers. And so when you see that kind of shift in millions of American workers, which I hope doesn't continue to the rest of the world, it has profound consequences that are economic and even for our mental health. So we really need to see the practice of management more quickly adapt to this environment.
And maybe my question is going to be a little bit more complicated. Do you think technology is making us unhappier?
It's hard to say. That is a very complex question. I think technology, like many advancements, has positives and benefits. I mean, you take the pandemic, for example, when all of us are stuck at home, there's nothing that kept us more connected than technology. And we have a lot of organizations to thank because of that. That said, there are also some negative consequences. One of the things technology has done is allowed for hate to just completely spiral online. Now, whether or not it is a cause or if it is something that is a result of how we feel, but where you see this political divisiveness that's not only taking place in the United States, but it's a pattern that's observed around the world, according to one of the more recent UN Human Development reports. So again, I think it's just like many other sort of advancements in society, that there are benefits to it, but there are also some things that we need to be careful about.
You mentioned in the book, what can leaders do about all this? Unhappiness, how to improve the place where people gather and spend most of their time. How can leaders contribute also to create a better economic prosperity sentiment? I mean, there are many things that you tackle in the book, but what are those lessons that you mentioned and that you maybe have rethought on what can leaders do today from the private sector and the public sector to address these blind spots, but effectively change maybe the emotional sentiment of the population or their workers or their an ecosystem of work?
Well, I think two things that governments have implemented, at least with respect to loneliness. One is that, in Japan, and this is done in the UK, is they implemented ministries of loneliness and they started to study the issue. And so what does that mean? What are the results that come from something like that? Well, I think one of the best ones, and again, this is a second example, is that here in the United States, we had hotlines for suicide, but they were done at the state level. And this is, almost like it couldn't be more tragic. But for whatever reason, it wasn't resourced appropriately. There was even a story about it where one gentleman called the number because he wanted to kill himself. And he called the number and no one answered. I mean, it's almost as tragic as one could imagine. He actually thought, what a joke, and it caused him to continue on with his life. And so one of the things that the United States has done is nationalize the program. And just like 911, there are 3 letters that someone can dial. And they've resourced it. And I think these are bipartisan initiatives that everyone can rally around to say this is probably something for humanity that is a good thing. So those are specific policies that I think from a public sector perspective can be really good. The second one, though, from a private sector perspective, is just this concept of encouraging friendships at work. Now, a lot of times when we work with organizations, they see this thing about do you have a best friend at work? And they always kind of chuckle and say, well, what am I supposed to do about that? One thing is don't force it, because there's nothing more awkward than trying to force friendships at work. And if they don't come naturally, fine. But there was a concept that was actually in The Economist a few years ago, and they had watched the Beatles and what it was that caused the Beatles to have so much success. And the concept was they jammed constantly. They played others' music, they made up their own sounds, whatever it was. But it was just the time that they had spent together on a shared mission, that they enjoyed, that actually helped create some of those bonds. And that's true in workplaces too. And usually people join a particular industry because they're joining like-minded people to work on similar issues. And as a result of that, they develop friendships. And so as workplaces observe and manage, what they should do is just be open to those types of things, because it's not only something that reduces turnover, but it has other benefits from a mental health perspective, and they look out for each other. So we even see in blue-collar environments that people who have score highly on best friend at work, they're far less likely to have accidents at work. So this is a very good thing, I guess, in the words of Danny Kahneman, the late Danny Kahneman, to encourage friendships at work.
Jon, now that you mentioned this, we were both together in the Milken Institute conference in LA. And I remember that Michael Milken mentioned in one of his presentations how in the United States, the population was feeling about their trust in the American dream. And I was shocked by hearing that the segments of lower income are every day more and more distrustful about the American dream, while higher levels of income, you have the more trust in that sentiment. How do you feel that can be changed? And my question is, I connected also with loneliness, with unhappiness, with many other sentiments that you've measured, but I think trying to rebuild a sentiment of confidence in the American dream is very important for the future, and it's very important to depolarize the country. But I wanted to try to ask you this to see if you find any connection, and in the solutions that you've shared, if this can also contribute to raise the sentiment of trust into one of the beliefs that I believe is a cornerstone of the American democracy.
Well, let's first examine why it was so critical to do that particular study at that time. And there are a number of indicators that we watch in the United States, one of them being confidence in institutions. So Gallup has been tracking confidence in an array of institutions for 55 years now. We look at confidence in the military, in organized religion, in the Supreme Court, and of this entire host, again, labor unions, public schools. We find that the amount of confidence that Americans have in the totality of all of those institutions just reached a new low this past year of all the 55 years that we've been measuring this particular item. So number one, Americans are losing trust in the institutions here in the United States. The second is when we ask Americans, do you think this country is headed in the right direction? And an overwhelming majority of Americans are saying, no, I don't think it is, which causes us to then examine a third indicator, which is their pride in America. And so we ask them not many weeks before the 4th of July to say, how much pride do you have in this particular country? And the percent who say that it's the highest amount has been in decline for many years now, and it reached its lowest ebb most recently. So the combination of those three made us wonder, has it now torn at the very ethos of the American dream? And that's what caused us to do this further examination to say, is it still alive and well? And number two, what do people think it is today? Is it sort of the, a home, a great job? Is it about opportunity? Is it about freedom? And this examination has led us to exactly what it is that you said, which is, a lot of people do believe, and there is high alignment about what the American dream is, which is freedom and opportunity. But I think one of the challenges is can they actually achieve that dream? And do they actually believe that getting a great job and being able to afford things to take care of themselves and their family is becoming harder and harder to reach? And even one of the other indicators that we look at, I think one of the challenges is basic things like inflation. And so we now see a marked increase in people who are saying that they're struggling to afford basic food. And so I think when you see things like that, they start to wonder, how is it that I'm going to achieve the American dream if I can't even afford to put food on the table for my family? So that's one of the things that we're seeing right now that Americans are really concerned about.
John, since time is moving fast and I can stay with you talking on all these topics for days and hours, non-stop, I want to maybe ask three questions. One is democracy, because you mentioned the American dream, which is very important. You mentioned about freedom, but I have seen that the world is experiencing some sort of a democracy deficit. Basically, almost 70% of the world population, roughly speaking, is now under kinds of authoritarian regimes. Maybe a decade ago, it was around 48 to 50%. So authoritarianism it's expanding. Are you putting attention to this trend based on maybe the sentiment that many people are feeling happier, quote unquote, in more authoritarian regimes where people tend to privilege more security than any other liberties? And how dangerous can this be if people have the wrong reading of this situation?
Well, in America, there are definitely concerns about democracy. And I think the concerns that exist around democracy are different based on the individual parties or even the significant rise that we see. We've never seen such a high percentage of Americans as they are today that identify as independents. But to your point, you're right. I mean, the number of global indicators that suggest that there is a weakening in democracy is true. And I think this comes back to some of the basics or the needs that citizenries are asking for from the leadership of their countries, which is why many years ago, Gallup built sort of a theoretical framework that we call the Gallup World Path on what does it look like to advance a society. And it is loosely based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the very foundation, two of the concepts are just law and order. Do people feel safe walking alone at night? And that's an indicator that we now track in 140 countries every single year, because the best leaders in the world that we interviewed, we said, what is it you're trying to achieve? And they said, well, we don't want to just make people safe. We want to make people feel safe. And those are two very different things. And now that feeling of safety is actually now included as one of the metrics in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to understand progress for societies. And the second thing that we look at is just our basics met. Are people, do they have affordable shelter? And are they getting food on the table at night? And as you and I both discussed previously, that FAO has now reported that debilitating hunger has been on the rise for about 10 years globally. And it's hard to see it in many of the countries around the world because obesity is rising so quickly. And so this awful problem that we thought we had almost nearly defeated for the past 40 or 50 years of global hunger is now back on the rise, is a real concern. And I think is something that when people are looking at government structures, they're saying, what is it that I can get to feel safe and also, have it so that I'm not hungry every single night? And again, these are not necessarily concepts that are foreign to wealthy democracies anymore. And I do think it has a lot of people concerned.
John, are there any other blind spots that you have now picking your brains to maybe write a next book that you say, we're maybe not measuring so well that we must be aware that this must be a red light to be raised before the eyes of the world?
Well, I think the single biggest one is I wish the world had better metrics for understanding great jobs. And I say that because when you look at the global unemployment figure, it says something today that 5 or 6% of people are unemployed. And that's absurd because we know that, roughly 1/3 of the world is self-employed. And in many wealthy countries, the concept of self-employment gets blurred with the idea of entrepreneurship or the pride of being one's own small business owner. But in reality, over half of those individuals are not doing it because they're doing it out of opportunity. They're doing it out of necessity, which means that true global unemployment would be significantly higher. One of our estimates said that it might be 30 to 33%. when adding those individuals in. But you wish that we could flip it on its head. And rather than look to the lowest common denominator about the global job situation, about who has no work whatsoever, that instead we could develop a metric that says who has great work? What percent of the world has a great job, a steady paycheck, steady hours, but also a place where they have the opportunity to do what they do best. They have the opportunity to work with colleagues that, work hard with them on a shared mission. And they also have people that they feel like care about them every single day at work. If we had a metric like that, I think we could really change humanity.
So that takes me maybe to my last question. And it's if we're connecting all the dots of this great dialogue, what is going to be yours and maybe Gallup's next big project that we could see in the next months and years that you think is going to make us see things differently and maybe be more punctual and more assertive in the way policies and decisions are made by public and private leaders?
Well, one of the things that we're working on, I feel like if my colleagues are listening to this, they're going to say, "How dare you not mention this one?" Because there are many things that we're coming up with. But one that we're most excited about is this idea of, many know it as Strengths Finder, also Clifton Strengths. This idea that people can be put in touch with what it is that makes them great. And it's funny because almost every philosopher, whether it was Aristotle or business philosopher like Peter Drucker, said the first step in a great life is getting to know oneself and to know what it is that makes you great. But nobody ever told us where to start. And we gave them an algorithm so that they could start and better understand what it is that makes them great. And so we've started to accelerate the technology developments around that so people could more easily connect with each other and more rapidly understand each other's strengths. But then powered by AI, we're looking to take those strengths results and help better inform how they can use their strengths to help tackle the world's problems. So those are some of the things that we're the most excited about, and that we truly believe that we could have an impact in furthering human development and help fix some of the world's toughest problems.
Well, that sounds fascinating, and I think it's going to definitely have a big impact in the way we build happier societies. Jon, thank you so much for your generous time. Thank you so much for being with us in Tres Respuestas. I definitely look forward to have you in Colombia pretty soon. And congratulations not only for this amazing book, Blind Spots, congratulations for the work that you're doing. And we really appreciate for you to share all this knowledge and all these assessments. Wish you the best y gracias por estar en Tres Respuestas. Jon Clifton.
Thank you, Mr. President.